costs of achieving net zero, while still vague, are clearly big. This week, the government announced some support, a £5,000 subsidy for 90,000 households to replace their gas boilers with heat pumps. But the average cost of a heat pump currently is around £10,000. That's just one aspect of going green. Is this strategy fully thought through? I'm joined now by Chris Stark, Chief Executive of the Climate Change Committee, and Bob Seeley, the Conservative MP for the Isle of Wight. Hi both, thanks so much for joining me. Chris, to start with, give us your reaction to the government's announcements this week.
Well, we're 24 hours after the government dropped nearly 2,000 pages on us, so it's a huge amount of material to process. So I think I can only really give you my early reaction to it. But I think broadly, it's good. The government has been tasked with setting out a plan for reaching net zero. And if you look what they've published, it's hard to say that they have failed in that task. They've clearly laid out a detailed prescription in every area. I think that the test for us will be the extent to which the policies that are in that plan will deliver against the ambitions. But the ambitions now, I think, are broadly in the right place. So that's very exciting.
Bob, I'm sure you've been making your way through the many documents as well. What's your initial take?
Well, like Chris, I'm sort of doing my best to speed read them. I start with the executive summaries and then sort of move from there into various topics. I give the government its credit. It's trying to set noble goals. It's trying to do the right things. And zero carbon is a great ambition. I'm not sure I would quite go as far as Chris to say that the ambition is right, because I think, like a lot of people, I'm slightly wary of some of the things that we're doing on the way to having hopefully zero emissions at 2050 or at some point relatively soon afterwards. And my concern is not with the government's intent, because its heart's in the right place, and I think Boris, as the Prime Minister, had a very strong leadership on this, but our ability to deliver and our ability to effectively align common sense with some of these policies, because I think some of us, and not just myself, have concerns about that. And I suppose the political fear is that we are going to confront a reality where we can't deliver on this stuff. It's going to get very expensive and it's going to get very politically unpopular.
Well, Chris, what about one of those areas of contention? Gas boilers seem to be on the way out. We know that this tried and tested and cheap form of heating our homes is carbon emitting. But is the alternative feasible anytime soon? Only last month you were saying that heat pumps are not yet ready for mass market.
Yeah, I did say that, and I stand by that, because at the time what I was referring to was the fact that they are expensive. They're expensive. There isn't an installer community of any great size in this country, and we haven't done it at scale. Now, if you look across the water in a place like Germany, they're doing 1 million a year with similar climate, not the same climate, but a similar climate. They'll have a different housing stock, but their own challenges there. But we see around the world that heat pumps are a viable technology. So I think we are about to enter the mainstream for heat pumps. And I think what the government has done this week is hasten that by offering some incentive, financial incentive, for a relatively small number of heat pumps to be installed. But crucially, to make it clear that by the mid-2030s, they are aiming to phase out the sale of gas boilers, which gives us, I suppose, the market a trajectory now of over the next 10 years or so to prepare for that moment. What we're not clear on yet, although there's some intriguing stuff in the documents that have been published by the government in the last few days, is quite how we get from where we are today, which is about 30,000 heat pump installations a year, to where the government wants to be by the end of this decade, which is somewhere between 600,000 and 1 million heat pumps a year. And it's interesting that there is one policy that they didn't make much of yesterday, which is this obligation that they would like to put on the manufacturers of boilers to raise over time the proportion of heat pumps that are being sold in the UK as a proportion of the total heat installations that the UK makes each year. Now, that is a policy that could really work. We've seen that work in, for example, California when it comes to zero emission vehicles, a mandate, they call it, a mandate for sales. There's a mandate for zero emission vehicles as part of the package of things that was announced yesterday. So that idea of mandates seems to be back in fashion with the government. I suppose that might be one way in which we can see that large and very rapid scale up that we would need over the next decade and beyond.
That's an interesting point, Chris, because there's been a lot of criticism of the £5,000 subsidy to upgrade your boiler. People saying, well, that's not going to cover it, especially for low-income households. And the subsidy is only estimated to reach about 90,000 households, and we're going to need these upgrades to reach millions more. But you were saying that the timeline is actually for the market. It's so that companies know where the government's planning on going. And hopefully that brings with it innovation, brings costs down, but there's no guarantee.
No, there isn't a guarantee, and I think that's a reasonable outlook on it, and a reasonable point for you to make. The scale up that's required is enormous. I don't think we can escape that. The need to get to something of the order of 1 million low carbon heat installations per year by the time we get into the 2030s. From where we are now is a huge task. But what's interesting, I suppose, in the things that the government said yesterday, you can see a fairly clear plan to put the obligation on business, on the commercial operators in that sector to try and deliver against these targets, and that should put the incentives in the right place to bring down the cost for the consumer. You're absolutely right. The £5,000 per heat pump isn't really going to touch the side of this challenge overall. But it's a nice way to start over the next 3 years. So that should make some headway, I suppose. And I can see that policy having an impact in the overall mission that the government has set of bringing heat pumps down to cost parity with gas boilers. And already we've seen a response from some of the commercial operators, notably Octopus Energy, who've stepped up to say that they think that can be delivered even more quickly than 2030, which is the government's plan overall. So we may see now a race to install heat pumps at a cheaper price for the consumer, and crucially, the kind of skilled supply chain that we would need building up alongside that. And I think that is actually the bigger challenge, is how you build the installer community to the size that we'd need it to achieve the goals that the UK has set.
Bob, the Prime Minister's rhetoric seems to have changed actually quite a bit in recent weeks. More acknowledgement that this net zero target is going to need to be seen through the prism of working for the consumer and working for the taxpayer. And the government's actually very lucky that we're not having the debates that we were having 15, 20 years ago when I was a kid about whether or not climate change exists. The question now is how exactly we go about handling it, and what the target is, and how soon it should come in, and what the costs are going to be. Broadly speaking, the public is on the government's side, on the left and the right. Voters care about climate change. But I guess my question to you is, seeing as the government's already been willing to break certain manifesto promises to increase taxes in areas that the public consider important, like the NHS, is the government going to be more honest about the fact that, these changes come with a price tag, and actually taxes may have to go up again in order to combat climate change?
The simple answer is, as we can see from the debate that's happening in the newspapers, I think the government is divided on that, and I think the Treasury is more concerned about this than other government departments. I think for me, look, it might well be that when it comes to heat pumps, the green energy schemes have quite often failed in the past, or the green home scheme was not a success. So government schemes can still fail. What could well happen with heat pumps is what happened with wind turbines, that when actually the market kicked in and could produce economies of scale, actually the wind turbines have done extremely well. And it might be that in 10 years' time, there will be, as Chris hopes, and I hope, there's going to be a wide availability of heat pumps that will be more efficient now, because they don't work for all homes. They're not as efficient by a long way as boilers. And if you have to rip out all your piping because your piping is wrong for the enlarged radiators you're going to need, there are a lot of complicating factors here. My worry is just, I think we're losing a sense of perspective. The United Kingdom is responsible for 1% of emissions. And yet somehow we're told that because we have historic responsibility, because the Industrial Revolution started here, that we have a responsibility to go further, faster than other people. I'm sorry, I just don't buy that argument. If we got rid of every bit of carbon that we emitted in this country, you'd go down from 100% to 99%. And as long as countries like China are emitting 30%, are responsible for 30% of emissions a year, I just think we've got to have a sense of proportion, and we've got to drop some of the sort of quasi-religious fervour with which we're approaching this issue. We could decarbonise completely. It is not going to save the planet. So we have to have a sense of realism about what we can do and how we go about it. One other example, Kate, the government turned down, or the committee responsible turned down Shell's development of the Jackdaw field in the North Sea. We are hoovering up natural gas from other suppliers. Germany is largely dependent, between 30 and 50%, depending on the figures, depending on the type of fuel, from Russia. It is better for us, even if we're still emitting, to be producing our own gas and potentially supplying Europe than have the environmental and, frankly, security hazard of that gas coming from other states that, frankly, care much less about climate change than we do.
Chris?
Gosh, there's a lot to say about that. I mean, I think you're entirely right to say that we are a small proportion of global emissions. But I think the idea of net zero is a fairly fundamental one. And it's important to say that. The science says very clearly now that globally we have to get to net zero or we will keep warming the planet. And actually, in recent years, the science has become even clearer on that, including notably the report from the IPCC in the last few weeks. Now, I suppose the point here is that there is an argument to say that there's a historical legacy and that the UK should address that with an early date for net zero. But it's not the argument I would make. I mean, I think the argument for net zero is that since the world is on that journey, there are
Chris,
huge economic benefits to it. So actually setting that target and then aiming for it will create the new kind of markets, the new industries that will be benefits to the people living in this country in this transition. And I think that's the argument that the government has made in the net zero strategy that we saw published yesterday. It's also the argument that China and others seem to have accepted by wanting to supply into that market. Now, China is one of the countries that has set a net zero goal for 2060, as has the US, as has the EU. So there is another argument here about the trading bloc that's within that net zero goal. And we're definitely in it and amongst the lead of it. And maybe the last thing I'll say is on energy security. Of course, net zero itself buys the UK much greater energy security by being dependent on the very plentiful electricity supplies that we can have from renewables. We will be more energy secure, and nuclear in that mix too. So we are much less exposed to the kind of imported price fluctuations, imported fossil fuels that we are exposed to at the moment.
I'm sorry, Chris, just with great respect to you, on that last point, for example, that is only true in 20 or 30 years' time, provided we actually grip the modular nuclear reactors and build a lot of them, provided we increase wind power, provided we do stuff like invest in tidal wave power, so power from waves rather than lagoons. But actually, for the next decade, for the next potentially 20 years, we are giving up energy security. You look at Germany, and look, I'm with you in spirit, but it's just about getting there and actually having common sense here. If you look at Germany, they have given up. They're shutting the last of their 17 nuclear power stations next year. They are importing and using their own lignite brown coal. They've gone from being the clean man of Europe to the dirtiest man in Europe. They are effectively paying for Russian rearmament, potentially for Russia to re-invade Ukraine or to try to invade Ukraine again in the next year or next 5-10 years. And because we are becoming increasingly dependent on gas fields outside the UK, we are actually undermining our security, including our energy resilience and our energy security, because we're not continuing to invest in our own gas fields. It's the same argument, Chris, that I could make about the idiocy of offshoring your manufacturing to China and then claiming we're becoming greener. Half our emissions, as you well know, have come from, out of all our emission cuts, half have come from shutting down coal-fired power stations, a very good idea, provided we have replacements. Half have come because we've just outsourced our industry to China and generally and to other countries in that neck of the woods. And they are going to decarbonise much more slowly than us. So this whole process of virtue signalling, an almost narcissistic sort of virtue signalling about our own moral purity, is actually coming at the expense of making a potentially adversarial states, A, richer, and B, making the world dirtier because they are not taking the same attitude to climate change as we do. So when you say our security, we're better off, we are in 20 or 30 years' time. For the next decade, for the next 15, 20 years, we're actually endangering our security as well as exporting jobs to other countries and potentially adversarial states. It is a policy that could have been written by the Russians and the Chinese rather than Whitehall.
Chris, I want you to come back to any point that Bob made there and have your say. But I also want to ask you about this short-term versus long-term trade-off and the gains that are to be made, because we're in the midst now of an energy crisis. The cost of living crisis is looming over so many people in the UK. There's really no getting around that. And lots of people are saying, well, nuclear can be the solution in 7, 8 years' time, maybe 10 years' time. It can make the transition much more comfortable. But others are saying, well, too little, too late. How is that going to help us now? How do we get the balance right here without having to roll back the progress that has already been made in the UK in trying to get to net zero, while still acknowledging that this is a very difficult time for a lot of people who would benefit from their bills going down?
Well, I mean, there's again lots to say about that. I mean, I think if just as Bob has acknowledged, if we would like to have the kind of energy security that we will have in 20 years' time through the policy of approaching net zero, then we have to start on a journey somehow. I mean, I think every year we build out that domestic capacity for generating the energy that we use, every year we get closer to that goal. So I would say that is as good a time as any to start. Now, the other point I would make is that we have indeed done a lot by decarbonising our power sector. We've also become much more energy efficient as an economy. The outsourcing of manufacturing happened quite a long time ago now. Actually, you don't see that in the stats. And in fact, the gross value added we get from manufacturing has been growing over time. So there is a chance here to be decarbonised as a country and to have decarbonised industry, but we can't just have that overnight, and we will need, crucially, policy to drive some of that and to protect British industry from the costs of that decarbonisation. Now, I don't think we can duck that is a major challenge that sits here. It relates to the other challenge that you ask about the cost of living. And I'm not going to dress it up. There are costs in this transition. I think the aggregate position is a very positive one, where you have a very large investment to make as an economy, but a growing saving from those investments as we decarbonise. But this is a big challenge for the government. I'm not going to deny it. And the answer that we got from the government yesterday in the net zero strategy is that they want to put the onus on on commerce and on business to bring down the cost of this transition, alongside limited public spending to protect those who can least afford it from those costs. And it remains to be seen whether that strategy will work. I'm quite interested to see what the Chancellor will say in his spending review and his budget next week. I think that's the piece that we haven't yet seen that sits alongside the net zero strategy, but it's a huge challenge. I accept that.
Bob, last question to you. To use your words, these virtue signaling policies, which you say could have been designed in Russia or China, have indeed come from your very own government. So are these the words that you would put to your Prime Minister as well as to viewers on Spectator TV?
Well, I mean, I'm fairly blunt speaking, so people can, take it or leave it. I thank Chris for his honesty in this, because these are noble ambitions and nobody is doubting that. But I just think our desire to set an agenda and actually deliver the reality of it is not coupled up. And Chris is he's saying that, he's got the honesty to say it, so thank you to him, because there is going to be a big price. And if we're not going to have that threat from Labour, because their stance is going to be similar, but actually there are going to be a lot of people in the country who are going to be coming worse off, because this is going to cost our businesses and it's going to cost people as well. And politicians have to get re-elected. What my concern is that we will start rowing back from these rather than being more realistic now about, for example, being able the need to use gas and to continue to invest in our own gas field so we can supply ourselves and potentially Europe whilst we build the modular Rolls-Royce nuclear power stations, say no to the ridiculous untested Chinese designs, which we should never have been contemplating. This takes time and we need to be more honest. And I think because of COP and because we are for a variety of reasons, I think our ambitions and our goals are getting ahead of the reality. And I think politically, I worry that we're going to pay a price for that. And I want very much I share Chris's goal and the goals of the Prime Minister, because they're set out in our manifesto. It's how we get there and having the honesty to confront some of these bigger decisions, but also to keep investing in gas in this country rather than import it from much more unstable and more unfriendly states.
Chris and Bob, thanks for joining us.